Hi, guys.
Well, hello.
Welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Of course.
Pleasure.
How are you guys doing? How's 2021 for you guys so far?
Well, today, as we're recording, it is March 366th. So
That's right.
we're fine. We're doing well, pushing through, looking forward to a day that all of this recording and, individual work can be an actual concert.
It's been getting much better, at least since the beginning of the year. The beginning of the year was just a wreck. But no, things are going well. Got several things going on. I'm definitely right there with you with just not being able to wait until we can finally hear live concerts again.
Any fun projects do you guys want to share with us? What are you working on these days? Anything you want to exclusively share?
So I have several pieces that have been in the works since the COVID pandemic began. One of them, which will be released somehow, somewhere, and somewhen, is quite a long piece. It's called Parable of the Olive Tree, and that's a more recent exploration of Arabic maqam and trying to relate that to cultural heritage, and on the technical side, making comparisons with and against tonality, and seeing how these two languages interact with each other and contrast with each other. The piece is in two movements. The first is Nur al-Qamar, the second is Nur al-Shams, so shining of the moon, shining of the sun. And it's sort of supposed to tell kind of the story of, my culture. I'm from Lebanon, from the perspective of an olive tree, which is very important to Levantine culture. And yeah, hopefully, I can't make any promises about recordings or whatever, but we're looking to get something at least by the summer.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I can't wait to hear that. That sounds incredible.
Yeah, same. So in my life, speaking of genre fluidity, I am in the process of putting together a solo electroacoustic set, which I'm recording for the Brentwood Arts Exchange. Actually, this week it'll premiere on March 18th online, so I'll send you all the link. And this solo project is called Zooxanthellae, which is the plankton that lives in coral and gives coral its color. And actually, one of the signs of Zooxanthellae leaving the coral is the sign of coral bleaching. And so this project to me has been all about like tiny bits of color and tiny things that do a lot in the world. So it's me as a multi-instrumentalist and vocalist, and it's a combination like singer-songwriter project and electroacoustic project. So and the first EP for that project will be coming out sometime in May.
That's amazing.
Which is very exciting.
Yeah.
It's so cool.
Thanks.
That's incredible.
With the works that you both do, and the topic of genreability, I wanted to ask you each specifically, what, even before getting to this topic, what was one thing that was instrumental and inspiring in what you are doing these days? Like the kind of work you're doing, the person you are, the artist that you are. If you want to just explain to us a little bit about that, what your experience and background has been, or what has inspired that, we would love to hear that.
As a kid, I was always really interested in playing a bunch of different kinds of music. But I didn't actually start playing other kinds of music until high school when actually a current colleague of mine saw me get off the bus and said, "You play the cello, you want to be in a band?" So I did that. I'm still in that band, Pompeii Graffiti. Really a kind of mark point is when someone was like, "Hey, you want to do this?" And I was like, "I can do that?" And so I did. And that kind of was the catalyst for every genre that I've tried. That was rock, like indie rock. I now do a lot of folk. I do electroacoustic. In college, I got in really, really into contemporary music, which I think really forged the way for me to experiment in you name it. Because contemporary music, especially working with composers, it pushes you outside your comfort zone. And once you're able to go outside your comfort zone, you can do anything you want.
Yeah, so I started getting into music through like the band program in my schools and all that. And I initially was very focused on classical. Sometime during college, I realized a couple things. One is that I'm Arab, and I have a whole another culture of music and music theory that's just as expansive, if not more, than Western music's Western tonality and atonalities. You know, when I came to realize that and started feeling like I could explore music of my own identity, and pairing that with trying to decolonize, you know, my mindset, my practice, really trying to shed the whiteness that has been like painted on me, I got myself into a rabbit hole there. And especially now, since the pandemic started, one of the biggest changes in my practice has been getting comfortable writing electronic music and being able to work on Ableton, and finally learning how to connect like a microphone to a DAW, which is apparently something they don't teach you in conservatory.
Right.
You know, I considered last year to be just like a year of being in sandbox mode and trying out all of these different, both musical styles and techniques, and even, you know, different practices and ways of living too. I find music and my artistic practice, I want it to be a holistic part of who I am. So I've also put forward my philosophies, religious studies, and basically everything I learned, try to put them into a philosophical framework that works within my music and my aesthetics.
Nebal, I love that you're just talking about like just being a whole person. And I feel like this year has been, for every musician, composer, artist, we're having to figure out how to be a full person without this huge aspect of our lives. Yeah, I can't wait to hear the music that you write out of this too. Like that, I'm so excited to check out your newest works. That'll be really, really beautiful to see. Like, who are we all now? You know, that I think that's something that we're all going to have to be reckoning with in the next couple of years, even after the world goes back to whatever normal is now.
Absolutely. So first off, thank you. But yeah, no, being a whole human, I mean, especially like last year, like so much of our humanity has been stripped away from us. I feel like those in power are trying to create this like world order where we're nothing but work. And I'm like, that's not good.
Yeah, it's nothing like living in late stage capitalism. Like,
Right?
sorry, how long did it take for us to go political? You know,
It just makes me think of that classic like conversation opener that it's always like, oh, so what do you do? You know, and I was just talking to someone recently about that, and they were saying how like we shouldn't, I mean, maybe ever, but like especially now, like we shouldn't be talking about like, oh, so what do you do? Like what are you up to? Like what are you doing? We're doing just the same thing every day. What we're doing is not what we're feeling and what we're thinking and who we are. And I feel like that is so important. That's a really important distinction to make.
I actually, I love that point. When I was in college, you know, everyone's like, oh, what do you do? And I always had a really hard time answering that question, because at that point, I didn't have an elevator pitch for like what I was doing and what my career path was, especially for in a community of classical musicians. It's not that anybody thought like, oh, well, you're crazy. You're going to be in bands. What is that? No one said that to me. And I am so lucky. Nobody in my family questioned it. And none of my friends, they were like, of course, that's what you're doing. But I always really like asking new people, oh, what are you about? Because it's not just what our, you know, capitalist overlords are telling me. How are you productive in society? It's like, well, who are we as people? And I struggle with that a lot. So, you know, coming up professionally, I don't know how to describe myself as a cellist or as a musician. I really struggle with that. You know, I call it the elevator pitch. You know, what do I tell people at holidays? You know, we have 30 seconds to start a conversation. Like, what do I say? I have no idea. But now in COVID, we're all kind of like, well, who are we without our careers and our professions, and without our forward momentum, because I feel like everyone's been a little stuck. Even if you're making art and doing intrinsic productivity things for yourself, it doesn't have the same social media buzz value as it did in the olden days. So it's a really interesting problem.
No, I agree. And it's so interesting because that question also, like, it may change day by day. Like, one day I wake up and I have a new idea and I have a new project in mind that may not be at all what I was yesterday. Like, that's, I think, what's interesting about music, and especially newer music, more flexible music, I don't know, that it's like, I don't know, this day I'm this person and the other day I'm going to explore another whole different thing. And I feel like you both kind of touched on that, and it's so interesting because that's, I think, like, COVID really exaggerate that for me, and I feel like for a lot of people. Like, we just kind of had to go and explore things and had to find other aspects of ourselves and our personality and the work we do, and that's not necessarily a bad thing.
And I feel like being more intentional is too, like, kind of goes along with that. Like, I feel like we've had to just be, you know, a lot of things that we sort of accepted unconsciously, we've had to sort of bring to our consciousness and examine, because we're not just falling into situations. We have to sort of like create them or seek them out or whatever. You know, this is a very sort of general point, bringing a lot of things to the surface, I guess.
Kind of feeding off of like this topic and just like thinking about like the specific work that you guys do. Erin, I wanted to ask you, like, you know, these days or on the projects that you work on, I want to know, like, what these days is like inspiring your work. What are the thoughts that you have, especially because of the different genres that you really combine in your work? What are your inspirations coming from these days? What are you thinking?
Yeah, I've mostly been working on, in terms of like creating work that's meaningful to me, is this solo project that I'm in the process of recording for. I did a guided improvisation with one of my new music groups, Earspace, based in Raleigh, North Carolina. And they asked me to like write a description of this improvised piece that I was going to perform for my solo show. Mm-hmm. And I said something like, this piece is meant to be an intimate conversation between two friends who haven't spoken in a long time, and you feel better after you hang up. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that's, right now, I'm really inspired by how friendships and relationships are changing in terms of COVID, how our relationship to ourselves is changing with the time that we do and don't have on our hands, because, you know, there are some people that have no more time. They, you know, are now with their kids 24/7. There are some people who have absolutely nothing that is meaningful to them. And that's like, it's just a different varying forms of emptiness. And like, how do we feel better? Like, what is healing? And in terms of like how that translates into my projects, I don't really have a clear answer for that. It's just kind of allowing my ADHD, like, ooh, shiny something, to kind of get the better of me and keep following that. And eventually it's been leading me in some good directions. Like I'm trying to be in sandbox mode. Nebal, you said sandbox mode. And I was like, that's what it is. That's what it feels like. I haven't heard that term before, but that I'm trying to be in sandbox mode. So like, you know, trying to be playful, also trying to find a healing place, all those things.
Yeah, what do you have thoughts about that, Nebal? Like what's kind of keeping you going?
Definitely, I think the most inspiring thing for me, I mean, this is definitely one of those like feel-good stories that if you think about it even a little bit, it's terrible. But the way people have shown up for each other throughout this pandemic, and I think we're starting to see a kind of moving away from this kind of rugged individualism that we've been kind of hypnotized in, or not even hypnotized, because we were kind of aware of it before. But I think now with like COVID, once the pandemic started and everyone had to be home, everyone was told to get rid of your social life and only work, if you even have the option of working and the ability to work. There was so much lost that a lot of us got together and said, it was like, we're not leaving each other behind like this. You know, that led to a whole bunch of organizing that we haven't really seen, and a lot more solidarity that, I think is still there, and I can only see that strengthening. Mm-hmm. And I feel like a big part of my music is definitely to help foster that kind of communal organizing and solidarity.
I was just, thinking before this that, I feel like even though we haven't really talked that much recently, or we may not have even met that many times, but I feel like we have things in common in that our background is so much embedded in the work that we do these days. I'm very inspired by where I'm from and, the music of my country. And you, as mentioned before, you're very much thinking about that, bringing your background and your roots in your music. And I kind of want you to talk a little bit more about that if you can. How do you find that bridge? How do you find that connection? How do you feel, authentically, I guess, include that in your work?
Being first gen is definitely an interesting place to be, because a lot of times our families and our parents that move here tend to want us to kind of not know about what they've been through, and to just kind of be like, oh, we're in America now. We move on. I, as an artist, completely rejected that. I've actually found that to be a place of healing for my family. And, for me, it all usually comes back to the family and what is the legacy of what my ancestors have done before, and how has that led to who I am now. A big part of that is also being more open and understanding of my identity as a queer person, both gendery and sexually, which was something I grew up thinking was a total battle at odds. There's still the sentiment that, queer identities is a form of colonization, when in fact the colonization is the erasure of our identities. And it's definitely been the case for me. I didn't really feel comfortable in my identity until I really accepted the fact that I'm Arab, and then started to explore my own culture's history and that heritage. And that, all started with learning maqam, and I'm still a student of maqam. I'm definitely not close to being a professional at it. Please don't ask me to teach any of it or anything like that. But, getting the opportunity to learn that stuff myself, and, I just got to give a huge shout out to Johnny Faraj and Sami Bouchmais for writing their book Inside Arabic Music, and Sami for his YouTube tutorial series. Those are such great primers for getting started, and that has opened up a whole new world in my composition. But still, there's still an element of, creating something new and moving forward that I put in my music. I love exploring history and putting weird combinations of things that used to be so far apart into something new today. So for example, I talked about Parable of the Olive Tree. Well, it ends with a fugue on Rost. And you have those E half flats just kind of going as passing notes throughout four voices. And that's a fun, I don't know, other people have done it before, but the counterpoint is not heard of as much in the world of maqam. It's definitely a way of me saying oh, this is who I am. And despite what other people want me to be, I'm still saying that. And I'm saying that with full comfort and the full backing trust in my ancestors that came before me, and in my Druze faith as well.
How do you see the area new music scene being accepting of that or welcoming of that? And what do you think just needs to happen so that more of us hear that? Because, I'm interested that I did that, but I don't know how many other people know about it. And it's exciting and interesting. So I want to hear your thoughts about what could be done.
I definitely think John Saliapamananan, he is a performer. He actually plays cello. He's based in Indiana, and he does a whole lot of writing and exploration of musical systems outside of, the typical Western canon. And he is probably one of the most busy scholars who tries to decolonize our musical practice in a way that's pretty sincere. Part of it is kind of rejecting assimilation as a tool for diversity. I don't know, sometimes I feel an urge to either exoticize myself or reject it. There's not that many opportunities where it feels safe in the middle. And usually that comes in the form of, folks being unusually critical of your practice and just completely dismissing the fact that you're referencing something that's like just not studied in Western music. Or you'd like play a tone row and they're like, oh, that sounds like the desert. And I definitely feel more often than not the urge to exoticize myself. And when that happens, I've written before about, this being a constant message that we're a guest in a white space, as opposed to a valued voice that makes up the space. So I feel like there's a lot of work that needs to be done in decolonizing the new music scene. And a lot of that involves being aware of different styles of music and understanding what these different styles sound like, so that when they're being judged, but in all honesty, there should be a lot less judging. But if you are in a situation where you're in a panel like that, being aware of at least knowing when different musical styles are referenced, so that, you can give opportunities to folks who don't fit a very hyper-specific, sometimes aesthetic. Also, just like one more point is that in general, a lot of us have to be just in general better than our white counterparts. I definitely see it all being rooted in white supremacy, this kind of idea that classical music is at the top. So if you engage with other styles, you're like devaluing it. Of course, that's totally wrong.
Nebal, I sorry to jump in. I think this is like fascinating how you're speaking of this. I wonder if you see your Arab heritage as like a different genre. Like, why do we consider world music a different genre of music? That's always something that's kind of confused me. Like, world music as opposed to classical music. Like, what does that mean? What is that line? Why is that a genre fluid place to be? So sorry to keep putting you on the spot. I'm just really fascinated with what you're talking about. What are your thoughts?
I always thought the term world music is just hilarious.
What does it even mean?
I think my friend Nadia, once said, actually in a different podcast, that it's like, I feel like most music happens in the world.
Well, and there's also this whole concept. It's like it feels like a joke, but I think it's not a joke to some people. There's this whole concept of like the music from the skies. Like, there's just this music that exists and we're just like tapping into it. But that music is described as, like you say, as classical music, as Western white music, as the sort of pinnacle of it. And that is the thing. We shouldn't need to say this, but of course that's not the case,
And it kind of becomes even more kind of funny where you think about that most of these cultures that are othered and like called world music, their music existed almost centuries sometimes, or years and years before what we hear in the Western canon, right? That they had, like, Nebal, you were talking about Arab music, music that comes from that. I mean, those maqams and those scales and those modes, they go way back. And it was so systematic. It was like a serious whole world that people practice. The fact that we don't know about it doesn't mean it's other or it's less than. We just don't know about it because we're on this side of the world. And that's totally fine. But we need to change that if we're actually talking about, these things. Like, we need to know about it because it's just another thing. So I guess, it's like a whole other topic of music education and how that should be addressed at schools and whatnot. That's not my job here. But I think that's one of the issues. We just don't know what other things exist in the world.
Well, it's just like, Nebal, you were talking at like right at the top of the hour about like, oh, well, I'm finally learning how to like plug a microphone into a DAW. Is that not a genre of artistry that we have yet to tap, like us have yet to tap in? I was having like kind of a meltdown earlier this week. I guess it's only Monday. I don't know when this was. It may be Friday. And I don't know. Time is meaningless. that I was recording, and I was like, why does everything I record sound like hot trash? Why does it all sound so bad? And a dear friend of mine said, well, Megan Shanley on the board of DNMC, she said, Erin, people get advanced degrees in recording. You can't screw around with it for a year and think that you're just going to be awesome at it. And I feel like the same can be said of genres and different cultures and histories of music. I'm honored to like be here talking about like playing in different genres, but I would say I feel much like a jack of all trades, master of none. And I also feel often that when we go between genres, like when I play jazz, when I sit in a jazz session, when I play Celtic music, when I play rock, these are stolen styles of music. And I am not part of the culture, and I can only be there to respect the culture that I am inserting myself into. That's something that I've been trying to be very conscious of. I mean, I can't do it right all the time. I'm sure I've screwed it up. And like, it's just that being super conscious of that. I think the DC scene, I think all of contemporary music is finally, in like about time, starting to like wake up and be like, oh, are we tokenizing people? Oh no, it took you long enough, but yeah, okay. Like, so it's just a really interesting time to be in the scene and be in the DC scene.
And I think it's a great point that you raised, Nebal. When music is being judged, of course, maybe it doesn't have to be judged nearly as much as we do, but that it was a really important thing that you touched on, that it's on, like, you know, in this situation, for example, like us, you know, we as the sort of like organizers of something like this, as DNMC or in whatever other capacity, it's on us to familiarize ourselves with those things. It's because it's one thing to just say, oh yeah, we're inclusive. We'll listen to any type of, you know, like we'll listen to anything that you submit. Sure. But if we're so entrenched in where we have come from and the, you know, the sort of aesthetic that we're used to, without actively seeking out, you know, these other styles and things that are equal to the music that we know, right? Then it just perpetuates itself. Then we just naturally will just be like, oh yeah, I like this piece because it is something that we are familiar with, something that we're comfortable with.
And like about, you know, Erin, you said something earlier, like, you know, it's different as a composer versus a performer. As a performer, I feel like it's partial. I mean, not only just like the music has to exist so that we can go and discover and play, but like as performers, we have to seek it as well. Like we have to ask for it and we have to include it in our repertoire, because otherwise, when I have a recital or a concert and I don't perform anything other than those normal stuff, well, what am I doing then? Like, it's part of my responsibility and also journey as well to try and seek that. And both in an academic setting and in a, like, you know, later professional setting, whatever you're doing, you have to do that. And I feel like our educational system, especially in college and, you know, graduate degrees, sometimes, depending on schools you go to, but most of the times it's like not really pro that, because we have to learn. And that's the problem. They don't consider that educational. It's not included in our education. And I feel like the more performers seek that out and the more it's heard, then it would enter that canon. I don't know, what do you think about that as a performer? Like, I know that you do a lot of that. You do perform a lot of music that's like from different genres, but like what else can we do? Like,
I think normalizing being uncomfortable is a really important part in how, not only in how more performers and more composers familiarize themselves with music that is not the harmonic language of 18th century German men, but also how the scene as a whole becomes more inclusive to more kinds of music, which everybody wins. Everybody wins if we're able to do that. So one thing that I think holds a lot of people back from opening themselves up to the possibility, especially like classical patrons, classical, strictly, 18th century harmonic language of German men composers, it's really difficult to detach ourselves like from this classical tradition in which we've been entrenched. I was really lucky to go to Ithaca College in upstate New York, which has been making the news for some not so great things, but it was a really wonderful place to go to school when I was in undergrad. But one of the things that really set that program apart was their emphasis on, hey, classical isn't the only thing out there. You want to try this, you want to try this, you want to try this. And we actually did have for a conservatory environment, a very level head about like, hey, you might not be playing like in a string quartet touring with Beethoven for the rest of your life. So I feel like I was able to explore that. And I also had professors and teachers and mentors that taught me how to sit with the really uncomfortable feeling of abruptly being not good at something. We classical musicians were not really taught to learn by ear all that well. So Elizabeth Simkin, one of my mentors at Ithaca College, she had one of the grad students hold a fiddle tune learning session because he had a background in specifically County Clare Irish music. So we learned fiddle tunes, and that was awesome. And it was so hard because there's so many notes and so many ornaments, and you have to remember all of them all strung together. And I'd never experienced before. It was amazing. The conductor, the music director of the orchestras when I was there, Dr. Jeff Meyer, who huge impact on my life. He directed the contemporary ensemble and brought in a lot of different versions of contemporary. It wasn't just that one like, oh, serialist, atonal. We played stuff from all over. It was incredible to see the breadth of music available to us. And I think that's so important, but it also involves more open performers who are willing to be wrong and willing to be not good at something and acknowledge that we are only good at the one thing we've been trained in so far, but it's so far. I think that's really important, and that's how everyone moves forward. Sorry, I do not mean to be rambling. My goodness, I have a lot of thoughts on this apparently.
No, that's great. I love that. I had just one slightly related thought in a possibly similar or possibly different direction just throughout the course of this conversation. And I just wonder what both of your thoughts are on the role of labels, I guess, for like a lack of a better word. As a composer, I feel like I get asked this question like, oh, so what type of music do you write? And that's just like the worst question. Even if I have a definition or something, I don't really. But if I did, it would be through a certain lens, through a certain viewpoint, and you don't know what viewpoint they're asking the question from. How useful are they? Are they useful? Like, what is good or bad about saying that this is one type of music and this is one type of music?
Yuval, you want to take a crack at that one?
I mean, I feel like if the next person who asks me, like, what kind of music do you write, I'm just going to be like, I'm non-binary. Just like, leave it at that. But I mean, like, I feel like there is value in, understanding different traditions and not separating them, not letting there be borders between them, but letting them exist in their kind of malphagus shape. That's kind of how I like to view genre. You know, those kinds of maps where someone will just kind of draw over it and there's so many layers that overlap and they just blend with each other, and it's not really clear where one starts and the other begins. That's, I feel like, is more realistic with different genres. Even if you consider maqam and tonality, the two are not separate. They've been in conversation with each other pretty much, since recorded history. And you find that over all sorts of different genres. That's one of the most fascinating things to me, is seeing, okay, how did this culture's music relate and communicate with this other culture's music, and what is the power dynamics between them? Is this a shared trade? Is this one colonizing the other? All of that. I think understanding the genres as a communication between different people, individuals, communities, and histories, I feel like that's better than, considering it as like boxes with labels. But that still leaves me saying is like, I'm, non-binary in my music. And I think that should be celebrated more, as well as just letting people exist in these kinds of in-between and new spaces. Because I was talking to a friend about this recently, and we were relating music right to the immigrant experience. My music is not completely Arabic in the most traditional sense. I am not going to say it's not Arabic, it's not American, but they're not traditional in those senses. It's something new. I don't consider myself like American, so I'm not going to say that it's like half of this and half of that. I consider what I do wholly Lebanese, wholly Arabic, wholly Druze, all of that. But it's still definitely morphed by my experiences that are almost entirely unique. So I think at the individual level, I definitely am in favor of kind of throwing those away, because I think when you get into the individual level, that's where borders start cropping. That's where you start having people say, oh, well, I'm part of this group or I'm part of this group. And I feel like I'd much rather have people understand that there are different musics out there and say, oh, I'm going to engage with this one. I'm going to have a conversation with this one. I'm going to, support the decolonization efforts of, this group of musicians. That also brings more life to it. It makes it more of a living entity.
It's interesting. I feel like the labels are so unhelpful in so many ways, but occasionally someone says the perfect word that makes me feel very seen as a cellist, as a person, a teacher, a human. And I think those kinds of words are really valuable, but not labels. Like, words are different than labels. Descriptors are different than labels. And it's a really fine dotted line distinguishing those two things. Everything you just said, Nebal, I think that's really interesting. I also think that the labels thus far have separated all different kinds of music so that we see them as more separate than they actually are.
Right, because once you start, categorizing and othering, it's so easy to then jump to value judgments. Like I said, I started this by saying, when people ask me what type of music do I write, I'm sure that's not even nearly as difficult for me, as someone who is less genre fluid, I guess, but has the desire to be more so, maybe. I was
just gonna say, my favorite question that anyone's ever asked me about what I do is oh, you're a cellist, what kind of sounds do you like to make? And I was like, and then it started a conversation oh, that's lovely, I love that. So that there are ways around it, we're not accustomed to them yet.
That's true.
Yeah, that's a great question.
I love that question. And didn't that make me feel seen? Oh my gosh, that made me feel so seen. And so open to a conversation about music's place in my life.
And it just goes back to, I think why that question is so nice is that it doesn't have to do with who you are, what kind of label, what kind of music. It has to do with music, sound, what we're all after, right? After all, it doesn't, I don't know, to me, it doesn't matter if it's Mozart or Kimia Hasabi or Erin Snedecor. You know what I mean? They all made music of their own, or they made music. It doesn't matter what's better or what's worse or what's more common or not. It's all music. So if we, I guess, ask each other about that, if we're creative about music, then it's just all more organic and wholesome, as I guess you each talked about. I think I don't know how, but I think that's the kind of work we need to do, thinking more about that rather than where it came from and how it is. And one thing that we do in our podcast is that the previous guest asks a question for the future guest. So our previous guest asked you guys, can I give you a hug?
Only when we're all vaccinated.
Yes.
And I guess I'm asking each of you if you guys have a question for our future guest, and if you want to share that with us.
What kind of sounds do you like to make?
There you go.
It's weird because you told me to prepare for this question. I just If you could learn one other style of music and become a master at it, what would it be?
Well, that's a good one. I want to think about that.
I want to think about that too.
Yeah, I don't know whoever you are who are watching or listening to this, I don't know when you're watching it, but it is getting into the later evening when we were recording it. So we might all be fading just a little bit.
hours of Zoom and staying to monitor. That's what does it. It's been so much fun talking to you guys, and I could do this for hours, but I'm sure that we all have things to do. So if there's anything that you want to just, say to wrap up the conversation, any thoughts about all the things that we discussed or other things, please take it away.
Or anything you want to promote, so that our listeners might be interested in checking out. We would love to amplify that for you.
I just want to say, Nebal, it is a pleasure to meet you. Hopefully someday we can work together in person. Would love to meet you in person at some point.
I would love that. It's a great pleasure meeting you too.
I have that show streaming with Brentwood Arts Exchange on March 18th. I'll send it to DNMC, so maybe they can cross-promote that. And that's for my solo project, Zozanthelli.
And I'll send DNMC a recording of whatever my next piece is, whenever that happens, however. But one thing that is always going on is I do have a Patreon. If anyone wants to come and subscribe, I post reviews / kind of meditation on a different piece about twice a month, as well as regular articles. I'm experimenting with my own form of podcasting on there too. So if any of that interests anyone, I would love to have you join the Patreon family.
Thank you both so much.
All right. Well, great stuff. This has been great. I've super enjoyed this conversation. And I guess we will see you in the next one. Like I said, I don't know who our next chronological guest is going to be, so you will find out in a month.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, of course.
Joining. Yay!
Yay.